Welcome to the Klutch Kitten Gaming Podcast, where I play an indie game for 5 hours and let you know whether or not it's worth your time and money. Hello and welcome. This is James, also known as Klutch Kitten, and I am so happy that you're here for episode 20 of the podcast. If your Thanksgiving weekend was anything like mine, a ton has happened since our last show. Probably the biggest news for myself is that I got into the spirit of Cyber Monday and purchased a Nintendo Switch. Also, my wife Lydia and I went into the wilderness and cut down this year's Christmas tree. Honestly, having Christmas decor and a Christmas tree around makes the cold and damp weather so much more bearable. Also, having a Switch will make those cold and damp days definitely fly by quicker. In terms of the Switch, I'm actually so excited. I'll definitely be getting into all the Mario games and Breath of the Wild, but I'm also stoked that the Switch has become in some ways a sanctuary for modern indie games. Obviously, if you game on PC like I usually do, you have access to the widest variety of indie games at some of the best prices, at least when Steam has sales. But I'm stoked to be able to review some games on the Switch now, since that means I don't have to be tied to my desk if I don't want to be. Since this week is pretty light on news, I have just a few quick announcements before we jump into our game for this week. If you really enjoy the podcast and have become a regular listener, I encourage you to consider leaving a 5-star review on iTunes or wherever you listen. I really would love to give you a shout out on the podcast, so if I somehow miss a review you've given, feel free to shoot me a screenshot and send it to clutchkittengaming@gmail.com. Something my good friend Courtney pointed out to me this last week was that the roundtable episode with Octavio was showing up with the audio from a different episode on Spotify. This stumped me because the audio seemed to come through fine on all the other platforms I was looking at, but if you listen to Spotify and noticed this, know that I'm aware and I'm trying to get things fixed. In the meantime, you can definitely head over to Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Podbean, Pocket Casts, Stitcher, or pretty much any other podcast place to hear the correct episode. This week, we're going to be talking about a very unique game. When I think of games that seem to make it onto every platform, including old school flip phones, I generally think of Tetris and Pool. This iteration of consoles and PCs is no exception because today we're going to be looking at a billiards game called Pool Panic. What's so unique about another pool game though? Let's jump right in and find out. Today's game is called Pool Panic and is the world's least realistic pool simulator. Well, that's according to the game site and not me, but I do completely agree. It's actually quite challenging to place Pool Panic in a genre because of what an odd game it is. If I was to stab in the dark with a genre title, I would call it a billiards puzzle adventure game. We'll get more into it later, but what you'll realize is that this is less of a pool game and much more of a puzzle game that uses pool mechanics. It was released on July 19th of 2018 and was developed by Rechem. Just to give you a quick glimpse ahead, this game was published by Adult Swim Games, which should hopefully give you an idea of what kind of wacky game this is. According to Rechem.com, the company was founded by Mike Robinson, who previously was a gameplay programmer for the title Hohokum. In addition to that, and quite a few other jobs, he spent 9 years as the head of technical at Zombie Flesh Eaters. The other main designer for Pool Panic is a guy by the name of Angus Dick who did all the art and animation for the game. According to Twitter, both Mike and Angus live in London, and from what I can tell, Pool Panic is the first game made by Rechem, although obviously not the first game made by either of these guys. Pool Panic currently costs $14.99 on Steam, and according to HowLongToBeat.com, the main story takes 5.5 hours, and if you want to play the main story with all of the extras, it can take upwards of 8.5 hours. Something to keep in mind as well is the local multiplayer options, which can take as much time as you want. In terms of the controls, the game actually recommends using a gamepad, but I found mouse and keyboard to be much more intuitive. That being said, the controls were one area where I think the game felt a little bit short. The actual act of hitting the cue ball with your cue wasn't always the easiest, and due to the pace of the game, the controls felt somewhat frustrating. Let's move on now to the narrative of the game. Clack! You sink the red ball in your way. Whack! Thunk! Thunk! You sink the last 2 shivering spheres before you turn your eyes to the shadowy number 8. He knows that his time has come and prepares for impact as you tap him towards the corner pocket. All is won. That's your job, right? Break up parties, knock balls towards pockets, and sink the 8? But why is nothing happening? You look back towards the hole that sounded the shadow's death and notice a light. A brightness emanates from the pit and beckons you. There's nothing left on this table, no more friends to separate, so you take the plunge. After falling for what seems like hours, you find yourself on a grassy hill overlooking a sprawling area. Neighborhoods, forests, roads, and so much more. All for you to explore. Pool Panic is set in a world where everything from mice to boars to lumberjacks are billiards balls, and it seems to take place in a relatively current-day world with construction machinery and normal-looking houses. When it comes to the primary characters, it's pretty much just you and unnamed cue ball. Just like with Pit People last week, I haven't finished the entire story yet, so there is a possibility I'm missing some other main characters, but I'm guessing not. Although character development is pretty non-existent, what is super intriguing about all the different pool balls is that they each have their own personality. This is a very cartoony looking game where each ball character has eyes and a mouth, and many have different embellishments to show what they are. Some have teeth, legs, hats, or stylish hair, and they each act in a different way. In most billiards games, you don't expect to see the balls looking back at you while you take aim, but Pool Panic is not like most billiard games. We must remember that this is the world's least realistic pool simulator. As such, when you take aim, you get to see the ball's reactions. Some cower and cry that they're about to be hit. There are ones that have legs and roller skates that look extremely devious as they ready themselves to dodge your shot. The boars show their teeth and charge at you if they see you charging up. There are a ton of different characters in this game, and it's so fun to experience all their different reactions as you're playing. So what's the crux of the story? From what I can tell, your goal is to bring a counter down to 0. As you complete levels and challenges, a number that starts above 100 starts to creep down, and inversely, a mountain starts to grow as the number gets lower. My guess is that once you hit 0, an endgame boss will be triggered, but I still haven't made it there. As you can probably tell, this game isn't story rich. It does have a ton of personality, but in terms of the actual narrative, you're really only learning about the area through walking through the scenes in each challenge and through walking around the overworld. When you get into the overworld and start walking around, you'll realize that there's a bunch of different zones on the map. There's a construction area, a forest area, a suburb area, and so on. And each of them have their own challenges that give small vignettes about what life is like there. In the forest, you have a campground level with tents and a barbecue. In the construction zone, you have wrecking balls and lumberjacks. And in suburbia, you have marching bands and track meets at the local school. Each of these levels or vignettes broadens your understanding of the world slightly, but in the end, the main purpose of changing up location is really for variety and mechanical progression as opposed to furthering the narrative or story of the game. That basically answers our last question, which is about the importance of the narrative to the game. Even more so than with Pit People, the story of Pool Panic is just there to provide a loose structure, but the real bulk of the game lies in each of the puzzles. Let's take a look at those now. So, if Pool Panic is the world's least realistic pool simulator, what do you actually do in the game? What helped me grasp what they meant with that catchphrase was to think of Pool Panic not as a billiards game, but as a puzzle game that uses some billiards mechanics. Most levels you enter in this game look vastly different from one another, and it was actually a rare occasion that the level looked like a pool table. You always drop in as the cue ball, and for most of the levels, your goal is simple. Get all the other balls into the pockets. Although your goal is simple, getting there was oftentimes not as simple due to a few different reasons. The first reason is the level layout. Unlike your typical pool game with 6 pockets and no barriers other than the borders, most of the levels in Pool Panic had obstacles and natural hazards. Some levels had additional pockets, or maybe just one. One level even had an intense wind that kept shifting, which made all the balls roll a different direction every 10 seconds or so. In one of the camping levels, there were little tents which not only were obstacles, but also hid quite a few of the balls. The unique maps made for some challenging terrain to traverse and kept the game fresh. Wow, challenging terrain to traverse. Man, try saying that 10 times straight. Anyways, we actually already mentioned the second complexity increasing factor already, the balls. At least in the beginning, it felt like I was being introduced to new ball types at every turn. There's one angry gray ball that slams down if you bump into it, causing all the balls around it to get knocked away. There's a night ball, like a knight in shining armor, that takes multiple hits to be able to move. There are really so many different classes of balls that each change how you need to interact with the puzzles. There were definitely some of these balls that were incredibly frustrating to deal with, specifically the ball with rollerblades, but just like with different maps, the unique class types kept the levels very interesting. The third and primary factor that takes this game from being just a basic pool game to a really unique and challenging game is the puzzle design. Obviously, both map and ball type play into the puzzle design, but the puzzles in this game do so much more than vary the characters and locale. In some of the early levels, there weren't many puzzly aspects. It was as simple as hitting all the balls into the pockets, but as I got further into the game, levels increasingly became more wacky and difficult. I think giving a few examples is the best way to illustrate this point. In one level, you're in the forest camping, and there's one ball that's at the top of a tree, and another that's at the top of a flagpole. I started going through the level and easily sunk all the balls on the ground, but to get those 2 balls down, I had to hit the grill multiple times in order to knock some hamburgers on the ground. Once you do that, the 2 balls run over and give you a brief opportunity to hit them into the pocket. You also have to hit a different pole multiple times in order to raise the flag and wake up 2 sleeping balls. In another level, all the balls are basically cattle which you have to herd down a couple pockets. This actually reminded me that I should explain one quick mechanic. Unlike in standard billiards where you can't move the cue ball unless you scratch, because in Pool Panic you're a live character cue ball with legs, you can move around during and in between shots, so in the case of herding the cattle, you don't even have to use your cue. You just run around and herd them into the pocket. The last example I want to tell you about is actually my favorite I've encountered so far. You're in suburbia and come upon a band, like a small orchestra, where the 8-ball is the conductor. You quickly notice that hitting the band members only briefly displaces them before they get back in line. What you learn is that you have to hit the 8-ball, which causes him to drop the conductor's hat, and only then will the band follow you to their death as you lead them to the pocket. I was cracking up when I did this level, and I felt so brilliant once I figured it out. As you can tell, the developers got incredibly creative with their levels. With over 100 challenges to play, this game could have become dull very quickly, but Reckham did an amazing job of keeping things fresh through their puzzle, character, and level design. The last topic I want to cover in regards to gameplay is the achievement system for each level. If you want to power through a level, the game is actually pretty easy. You can brute force your way through most of the puzzles, but where the game becomes really difficult is when you're attempting to get every achievement. Each normal level has 4 achievements you're trying to attain, and the more you hit, the quicker you'll progress in the game. It reminded me a lot of the star system in many mobile games. The first achievement is related to time. In order to get this, you have to beat the level before the timer goes into the red. The second achievement is Q hits. This is basically like a par for the level, so in golf you might have a par 3 hole. Similarly, Pool Panic has a Q par between 1 and 20 something. Every time you use your Q to hit the ball, it counts as a stroke. The third achievement is related to scratching. If your character, the cue ball, falls into one of the pockets, you automatically fail this achievement. The last and easiest achievement is related to whether or not you sink all of the balls in the level. As you can imagine, achieving all of these proved to be the toughest part of the game, at least for me. Often, I would get into a level and just try to get all the balls in and learn the mechanics of the puzzle before I would replay it and try to achieve the rest. If you're someone like me who isn't always the best at puzzles, I wouldn't worry too much because even though some levels are gated behind your progress in the game, it didn't seem too punishing. So far, I've always been able to move to the next area without having completed all the achievements for every level before. I think the achievement system was a great addition to the game as it provided a way to make the game more difficult, although I do have one complaint specifically about the timer. If you play a game of standard pool, it's not a game of speed. It's a game of slow-paced strategy and planning out your moves before each shot. As such, to me the timer took away a lot of the strategy. I felt rushed in each level, and although I could technically line up expert shots to hit multiple balls, there never felt like enough time. In addition, since many of the enemy balls could move, the game rarely gave me that slow-paced quality I expect from pool. Again, it's important to keep in mind that this isn't meant to be a legit billiards simulator. I personally found myself enjoying the slower-paced puzzles even more when they came around, but maybe you're the type of person that thrives in fast-paced puzzles like many of these are. Let's move on now to the art and sound design. What's funny to me is that we've taken a look at two very cartoony games right in a row, but they each have a very unique feel. This art is simple, colorful, and super fun. When it comes to comparing this to Pit People, I would describe Pit People as having much more of a South Park feel, whereas Pool Panic feels much more like Bob's Burgers. Pool Panic has a much more tame and cute world as opposed to the insane wackiness of Pit People. This actually came as a huge relief. The only complaint I have in regards to the look of the game actually has to do with the camera angle that's used in most of the puzzles. Unless I was oblivious to this option, there was no way to shift the camera angle on a level, which made some of the pool shots super hard to read. That's both an art and gameplay problem, but overall I think the art hit it out of the park. The sound design was also great. The soundtrack was decent and kept things rolling as you were figuring out the puzzles, but I think where the sound design really shone was in the details. Again, the band level comes to mind. The music gets messed up every time you bump a player out of the way, so if you hit a tuba player, that part of the music stops or slows for a moment until he's back in place. A detail like that made the level 10 times better than if the music wasn't tied to the gameplay. Similar detailed sound work was done throughout the game and really elevated the quality that the experience brought to you as the player. Now that we've talked about narrative, gameplay, art, and sound design, let's summarize and look at the positives and negatives. On the positive side, the puzzle design was superb. The developers took the basic concept of shooting pool and turned it into an adventure experience with such creative levels. Additionally, the world felt incredibly cohesive. From the art to the level design to the sound, the game gave off fun vibes without being in your face with its humor. Lastly, the difficulty seemed to scale well. If you're someone who's a puzzle novice like me, you can still progress, but if you're the Sherlock Holmes of gaming, you can strive to get every achievement in each level. On the negative side, I felt like the pacing didn't always match what I wanted. The timer pushed me to care less and less about being precise with my shots, which felt antithetical to what I should have been doing. This also made me more and more frustrated with the controls than I really needed to be. The actual shooting of your cue ball worked better at a slow pace than with quick shots. The other primary complaint I have about the game is the lack of camera angle options. Some shots were incredibly hard to see due to the angle, and that led to some frustration that I didn't really feel was needed. We've made it to the final boss. This is the part of the podcast where I tell you whether you should slay the game and buy it, flee the game and avoid it, or farm up and wait for a sale. My verdict is to slay Pool Panic. The pros most definitely outweigh the cons for me. If you're looking for a pool simulator, you might want to walk the other way, but if you're looking for a solid indie game that you can play either solo or with a friend, go ahead and give Pool Panic a look. as always, thank you guys so much for listening in and supporting the podcast. Don't forget to give the show a follow on Instagram and Facebook at Klutch Gaming and on Twitter at KKG Podcast. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and if you enjoy this show, consider telling a friend about it while you have a billiards battle in Pool Panic. I hope you have a great start to your December, and I'll see you in game.